Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I pray you're well, sending love and light to you and yours wherever you may be. Welcome to Path and Present. I'm your host, Baraka Blue, and we have a special guest this episode. We have Dr. Sherman Jackson. Dr. Jackson is the King Faisal Chair in Islamic Thought and Culture and Professor of Religion and American Studies and Ethnicity at USC and University of Southern California. And someone who I've had the blessing of learning from over the years and always found great insights every time that I sit with him, every time I listen to him, every time I read his works. But dust off your dictionary if you do read his works. They are challenging, but definitely edifying, alhamdulillah. So we had the blessing of hosting Dr. Jackson recently, a couple months back, just before the pandemic kicked off. So when we could all gather in real life and sit together. And it was a great blessing. We brought him, my organization Wasat here in Seattle, brought him in collaboration with MAPS. And it was a wonderful weekend that we got to share with Dr. Jackson. And during that weekend, we were able to sit down and have this conversation. So I present to you this conversation. I want to first thank everyone who supports Path and Present, especially those who are giving through our Patreon. If you want to support this podcast, you like these conversations and would like for them to continue, please visit patreon.com/pathandpresent, and you can become a patron, a supporter of these conversations. All right, y'all. Assalamu alaikum. So I found so much of my own journey in your writings, and I think there's so many ways we could go with this from, but I think just for those that have not heard, and again, elsewhere they can find you discussing this, but just a quick summary of this idea of the three resurrections, the Cliff Note version, if possible.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Cliff Note version. I always worry about talking about these things in a sort of in a way that doesn't allow to penetrate all the details. And I think that I've become even more sensitive to that in the last few years or so. And I think the reason that I've become more sensitive to it is that, and I talked about this a little bit last night. I don't know if you recall, but I'm increasingly aware of just how impactful the phenomenon or the event of 9/11 and its aftermath, and even now sort of punctuated by certain attitudes that are given off by the Trump administration and those kinds of things. I'm more aware of the acute sort of psychological, emotional effect that has had on large segments of the Muslim immigrant community. And all that's understandable. And I think one has to be sensitive to that. At the same time, that complicates these kinds of conversations, because when you start talking about, the three resurrections, Islam in America, that follows a trajectory that's largely separate from that of the immigrant community. To many of them, that sounds like you're sort of lining up with those who are Islamophobic and who want to, marginalize them and exclude them. You're excluding them from the American narrative. And, that's not the perspective at all. There does not have to be a single American Muslim narrative. If you take the the third resurrection narrative, for example, that's a narrative that begins with, basically the Nation of Islam, but you can include the Moorish Saints Temple in that, and it evolves, through Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm, through Imam W.D. Muhammad, and into Sunni Islam. Now, there are a lot of traditional black Sunnis who would not identify with that trajectory at all. But yet they wouldn't see themselves as being excluded from the history of Islam or the narrative of Islam in America. It's just it's a separate trajectory. So, when I talk about these things, I don't talk about them in a way that seeks to sort of monopolize the narrative of Islam in America in such a way that excludes immigrants or lines up against them or identifies with America against the quote unquote bad immigrant. I think that's an unfortunate occurrence that now sort of defines the spaces in which we have to speak, but it's there, and I want to be sensitive to that. So I just want to put that out there. This is not an attempt to to monopolize for the purpose of excluding anyone, although I will say that, and this is another aspect that a lot of people don't realize, because I've been a Muslim over 40 years, so I go back to a time where many of some of the people who are most vocal now, they don't identify with that. It was sort of before their time. But there were attempts to monopolize the narrative of Islam in America before. But be that as it may, the three resurrections. I focus on the trajectory leading from the Nation of Islam into Sunni Islam. Not, in fact, because that's my trajectory. I was never a member of the Nation of Islam. But what I find to be important about them is that, to my mind, they, more than anyone else, are responsible for the phenomenon of what I refer to as communal conversion in the black community. And by communal conversion, I don't mean that everybody just converts to Islam. But what I mean is that they construct a relationship between Islam and black identity that enables a person to be black and Muslim both authentically at the same time. This is something that I think is quite unique to the black community in America. So I'm sure that, like, as a white Muslim, I'm sure you encounter people like, what? Are you from Turkey or? It's hard to reconcile.
The real Caucasians.
The
real Caucasians are Muslim, which is ironic, right?
Right,
Chechnya
right.
And the Dagestanis.
But here in America, that association is rarely made, and so it's like. And by the way, this will be one of the barriers between many white Americans and Islam.
Yes.
Not the theology of Islam, not Sharia, not the culture, none of that, but the idea that, my identity as a white person, I have a hard time reconciling that with being a Muslim.
Yes.
All right? That's not the case in the black community.
Yes.
And the identification between Islam and black identity is not an extension of, the slave period where you have slaves coming into America from Africa. That's not an extension of that.
That's an important distinction. People assume.
Yeah, they do. I see the Nation of Islam, the efforts of Elijah Muhammad, and especially Malcolm X, whose 55th anniversary of his passing was just yesterday. I see them as being more responsible for that identification between Islam and black identity than any other movement in America, and that has been seminal for the history of Islam in America. Of course, the first resurrection was, the time where Elijah Muhammad argued that black people had suffered a mental death under slavery and the aftermath. as a result of which they needed to be mentally resurrected. And that was his mission, to mentally resurrect the black community. And so what he did, from around 1934 all the way up to the time of his death in 1975, that goes under the designation of the first resurrection. Now, when he dies, and Imam W.D. Muhammad comes in, rahimahullah, and he makes this just enormously courageous move to take the Nation of Islam into Sunni Islam, to expunge the problematic aspects of nation theology and to convert the whole movement into Sunni Islam. A feat for which I'm not sure he's been given all his due credit to this day. But when he does that, that comes to be recognized as the second resurrection. Now, the third resurrection is a neologism that I came up with, because what I came to see is that, by the time I came into Islam in the late 70s, already I could see a shift in the basis of religious authority from the sort of the perspective of black religion that sought to deploy religion for the purpose of coming to terms with the reality of anti-black racism in America. And the religion was sort of read through that prism so that it could be made effective in addressing that issue. That was already shifting to the historical intellectual tradition of Islam. And then, of course, you have, at the same time, the much more dense numbers of immigrants coming from the Muslim world who don't have anything to do with the first or the second resurrection in particular, and they're coming with a different perspective on what it means to define and articulate Islam. And so the basis of that authority is shifting to the traditional Islamic intellectual heritage. And what that meant to me is that if black Americans are going to maintain the ability to get Islam to speak effectively to the realities that define their lives, they then are going to have to at least gain facility in that classical tradition, if not mastery of it. Otherwise, they will not be in a position to speak for themselves. Others will be speaking for them, and speaking for them in a context where their understanding of America might not be that of the black American community. So the third resurrection, to my mind, was, okay, the authority under the first resurrection was Elijah Muhammad, an individual. The authority under the second resurrection was Imam W.D. Muhammad, an individual. The authority under the third resurrection would be mastery of, or at least facility in, the classical intellectual tradition of Islam that would enable the black American community, and that was the focus at that time, to engage in the kinds of discourses, the kinds of give and take, the kinds of, constructive thinking that would enable them to get Islam to speak effectively to their realities on the one hand, while ensuring that the authenticity, doctrinally speaking, was not lost. So that was the whole idea behind the third resurrection.
And so there's a balance that you point out, that grounding in the tradition itself, but also you can go to an extreme in that where you make your focus and your concerns such that you make yourself irrelevant to the broader context of the black American experience. And you point out that in fact the genius of the Nation of Islam, for instance, is that, and it's actually incredibly prophetic in the sense that Elijah Muhammad was able to articulate that our original nature is Muslim. Our original language is Arabic. We are from Mecca. We are the lost tribe of Shabazz. That you're not going to something foreign, you're going back to who you always were, in fact, that you have lost. And that, interestingly enough, for whatever heterodox theological constructions we could say, is the core message of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to the Arabs, that you think this idolatry is your tradition. You think this is the way of your fathers. But before your fathers, your true father is Ismail and Abraham. And that you are monotheists. And this Kaaba itself was a house of God, the one true God. And that, in fact, this is in a lineage of prophets all the way back to Adam. And I'm calling you back to the primordial state that you have always been upon. And so, in that sense, that is a profound understanding that you.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't particularly agree with Elijah Muhammad's myth making, and I don't think that even that kind of myth making in and of itself, in terms of its substance, was necessary. And I certainly don't agree with all the details of it. Now, the end to which he deployed it, I mean, that's another question. And I think that one has to be sensitive to the needs of a people that one sets out to serve, and that's what he was trying to do. Quite frankly, and I think that this is one of the aspects of quote unquote that classical tradition that's not understood, and that is that my understanding of the classical tradition itself, all right, is that it is always deployed in a manner, all right, that seeks to address the concrete issues on the ground wherever it happens to be. And this is why you'll find, even within a single school of law, all right, you'll find, the Baghdadi Malikis have one opinion, the Egyptian Malikis have another, the Malikis in Spain have another. They're all dealing with different social, political, social, cultural contexts, all right? And Islam is always about how you take the transcendent values, the transcendent virtues, the transcendent truths of Islam, and you concretize them, all right, in the historical circumstances in which you happen to be, all right? And I think that, again, the challenge that we have had is that, if you study overseas, then you're also, to some degree, you're internalizing the social-cultural, the social-political, the historical realities of the place in which you happen to be studying. When you come back to America, or if you just immigrate to America, what is required is a translation move. You have to translate all of that into a different social-cultural milieu, a social-political milieu, a different historical milieu, all right? And I think that is a task that we're still in the process of doing. But I mean, I didn't see this as anything unique to Muslims in America. All right, I mean, this is what Muslims, following that classical tradition, have been doing forever. Yes. I remember. When I talk about articulating Islam in a manner that it is relevant to the realities of America. Some people think that, that means, just exclude the immigrants. Nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, the reality is that that perspective was really solidified in my own mind by an old friend of mine who died in the 7th century of the Hijrah, somebody I worked on quite a bit, Shihabuddin al-Qarafi. And he says explicitly, if someone comes to you seeking a fatwa, you do not give them a fatwa based on the custom or the realities of your own country. You ask them about what is the reality, what is the culture, what is the custom of their country. And then you process the data of revelation and what the Prophet had to say in the context of that. That is real fiqh. Yes. All right? There's nothing American about that. That's Islamic fiqh.
That's right.
I mean, that's the intelligent approach to Islam. Right. So for me, that's what it's about doing in America. Sure. All right, and if we don't do that, my fear is that as bad as the perceived persecution, the Islamophobia, and all those kinds of things may be, yes, they are not the greatest threat to religion. Yes. To my mind, the greatest threat to religion. In fact, it's very interesting. I was in a conversation with a Jewish woman once, and I said this, that I didn't believe that persecution was the greatest threat to religion, and she said to me, you're actually right. In fact, it can be actually an enhancement. Talking about her own experience as a Jewish woman, and how the perception of being under threat by the outside world can redouble one's efforts. Sure. All right, can incentivize one to redouble one's efforts in terms of preserving their religion. But to me, the kiss of death is apathy born of irrelevance. That's right. Yeah. All right, where the religion is simply not relevant to the kinds of things that define people's lives. And oftentimes, it's not simply a matter of, okay, how do we sort of come to terms, let's say with secularism, all right? How do we adjust to secularism, all right? Mm-hmm. I'm not a big fan of all this adjustment. How do we readjust secularism? Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying? How do we modify it? How do we move it in a different direction? How do we then inject Islamic sensibilities, into the atmosphere in which we live? Yes. All right. Sensibilities that change the way that people think about things. Yes. It's who was it? I think I know Richard Rorty quotes him. I can't remember who he's quoting, but he said, the trick is, if you want to live by a particular chosen order, the trick is to create the tastes by which you will be judged. Right? Mm-hmm. And so how do we as Muslims do that in a place like America? All right? Which goes into another conversation that you and I have had on occasion, and that is that Islam is much more than its shari'at. In America, we will need serious cultural production in order to try to inform the tastes, all right, that determine how we are judged. And all of that, to me, is, that's part of my understanding of the classical tradition itself.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I love everything you're saying, and I think, in other words, I heard you say once that what the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said in 7th century Arabia was La ilaha illallah, and that was the most revolutionary statement that one could say. And you pointed out that if you were to walk through America today and said, there's no God but God, the one God, most people would say, yeah, okay, Mm-hmm. But you pointed out that it's not that phrase has become less revolutionary, it's that we fail to identify the idols of our time. Right. And that one of them you mentioned is white supremacy, mm-hmm. and the power of the Nation of Islam and Malcolm and these is that it identifies the idol under which the people are suffering. And it starts to crack that idol. And in doing so, it's like Islam was respected amongst black people because of a Malcolm, because of a Muhammad Ali, because of and Malcolm wasn't respected because of Islam, right? It was the opposite. It was that Islam became positively connotated because of these individuals who said, this is what Islam is. Mm-hmm. And I'm doing this on behalf of what Islam is on that level. But I think, in thinking also about, really what you're saying is like you have to understand the psychology of a people and what their wants and needs and hopes and dreams are, and you have to communicate an expression of a tradition that speaks to those things.
Yeah, but I think you also have to, I mean, look, we have to be very careful about something. It is true that La ilaha illallah was a revolutionary statement. But one of the things that we have to be very careful about, La ilaha illallah begins with a negation.
Yes.
And it's important to get that negation straight. And it's important for that negation to reach its fulfillment and its completion in terms of the complete denial of all ultimate authority to anything, all right, in this created world. And yet, having done that, all right, the task is not done until we arrive at the affirmation that comes on the heels of that negation. And oftentimes what we get stuck in the negation. And in fact, we may even arrive at a point where we complete the negation. But then from there, we don't get to the affirmation. So we get the La ilaha illallah, we get the La ilaha, all right? White supremacy that's not an ilah, that's not a God. We should not be bowing to it. That should not be the determinant of all meaning in creation. That should not be the thing that rearranges the furniture in my psychological, emotional universe. We get all of that, all right? But then what should? All right? Where is the illallah? And this is where you get into questions of theology and all kinds of other things. So I think it's really important for us to remember and to judge some of these movements fairly. I mean, you just have to see them in historical context. I mean, it's a relatively short period of time. But I do think it's important that, not only do we negate white supremacy or any other thing that's out there parading as an ilah, we have to complete that move, with the affirmation. All right, that we move from false gods to the true God in His revelation, in His guidance. I mean, and what He wants and does not want for us, both individually and collectively, and the whole. And this is something that I've become much more, I think, sensitive to in the last number of years. Not simply what Allah and His Messenger have said, but the whole enterprise of dedicated communities of men and women who have committed their entire lives to trying to, determine what that means in concrete terms, not abstract terms, but in concrete terms, on the ground, in the lives of societies and communities. That too is a part of our heritage. All right? Islam is much broader than just the Shari'at. All right? And Islam as a civilization was built by more than just Imam Malik and Abu Hanifa and Al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah and all the religious scholars, all right? There had to be military generals, right? There had to be architects. There had to be physicians. There had to be accountants. There had to be engineers. There had to be all kinds of people, all right, who added to the Shari'at, who sort of concretized them in terms of Islam as a civilization. And those things are just as meaningful to us today. And we need to get back to that. And I think that one of the tensions, certainly in Islam in the West today, is that we sort of assume that Shari'at are the only thing that is important for Islam as a civilization. As a result of which, everybody wants to have authority in Shari'at because that's the only authority that's recognized as Islamic. All right? Well, what if I'm just an everyday Muslim? I know my basics. I read Quran. I pray 5 times a day. I don't do any kaba'ir. All right? But I'm a master money maker. How is that not of value to a Muslim community?
Sure.
All right? Okay? Or I'm a master military genius. All right? Or I got the next best, I don't know, whatever that technological innovation might be. All right? How is that not of value for Islam as a civilization? Why would his activities in that regard be any less Islamically valuable, all right, than those of the scholar who is studying Quran and Hadith? If we're talking about Islam as a civilization, as it was always meant to be.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a profound parallel that I find in what you trace with Islam and the Blackamerican.
Let me stop you something. That book was actually, it was published 15 years ago. I've said this before. I actually started writing Islam and the Blackamerican over 20 years ago. I started, 1999, 2000, something like that. And then, to be honest with you, and this will be hard for lots of people to sort of understand today, because many of them were not there in those 90s. The 90s were tough, all right. The 90s was a period of a lot of schismatic strife among Muslims in America. Just a lot of strife. Let me just leave it at that. I don't want to reopen any kind of wounds or anything like that. So I started writing that book, and then, to be honest with you, I got concerned. You might even want to say scared. I got concerned that this book might add to the strife, to the schism, to the mutual recriminations that were already taking a toll on the community. So I stopped writing Islam and the Blackamerican, and then I went and I translated Al-Ghazali's books, Place of Tafriqa, on the boundaries of theological tolerance in Islam. Yes. And that was very purposeful, because what I wanted to establish is this. Okay, you may fundamentally disagree with the contents of this book or any other book by any other scholar, male or female. You may fundamentally disagree with it, all right? But let's get our boundaries straight. You follow what I'm saying? Because even though I disagree with something, disagreeing with it does not authorize me, does not justify my excommunicating that person from Islam, all right? And the best defense against that misguided impulse would be to lay out the criterion for the boundaries of who is in and who is out of Islam very clearly. And what we find is that they're quite broad, much broader than people think they are. All right. So I wanted to lay that out so that once Islam and the Blackamerican is completed, then we could have the knockdown, drag out kinds of debates and arguments, all right, with no one fearing, that excommunication could be the result of these kinds of debates. And I say that only to say that 15, 20 years, that's a long time ago, and there are ways in which my thinking has evolved. I think the basic thesis still. I mean, I would still abide by it. In some ways, I'm more convinced now of parts of Islam and the Blackamerican than I was then. But I think that book should be read in the context of 15, 20 years ago, and not necessarily seen as being a reaction to what's going on right now. Right? Because many people. At its origins, that was not a post 9/11 book.
Right, understood. Yeah, and I think that's really important, and I want to get in, inshallah, towards the end of this conversation to what since then. But one of the parallels that I really reflected on is that there is. I mean, you mentioned right. It's almost kind of comical that if someone says a black Muslim. That's normalized for us. Someone would say a black Hindu. A what? A black Hindu? That would be strange. And it's not that different if you were to say a white Muslim, right? Black Hindu, white Muslim, right? But interestingly enough, there are these, as I see it, two streams into the most broadest categories of Islam, right? And so you trace Islam and the Blackamerican. But this other stream is Islam and the white American. And I think if you go vast enough, you find that in the Renaissance period, there is, especially in places like Florence and, the kind of Neoplatonic academies, there is a interest in non-European religious thought, especially in mysticism and esoteric currents and these type of things. And then that comes into, of course you have the romantic poets in Europe. Goethe was deeply influenced by Hafiz, right? He considered Hafiz the actual greatest poet in human history, learns Persian so he can translate it. Goethe, considered the greatest poet in the German language history. His grave, there's a chair for him and a chair for Hafiz. Have you seen this? On his grave. And he actually wrote the East-West Diwan, that he is, it's a conversation with him and Hafiz. So the two chairs upon his grave are so that the spirit of him and the spirit of Hafiz, a Shirazi, can have a conversation. Then, that influences the transcendentalists in America, right? Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is considered America's philosopher by many, right? He is reading, he can read German but not Persian, so he's reading the German translations of the Persian mystical poets of Islam. He signs many of his poems Saadi, right? So they were even called the Cambridge Persians in Harvard at that time. Walt Whitman has poems where he says, "Oh Allah," he calls God Allah. This stream, and of course we could also mention, it should be mentioned that Emerson also was an abolitionist. He wrote against slavery, intellectual tracts against slavery as an institution. So you have this current, and of course, but it should be mentioned that it wasn't just like, oh, we're becoming Muslims. It was more an ecumenical openness to wisdom wherever it is found. So, those transcendentalists were deeply influenced by Neoplatonism and by Vedanta, right, Indian mysticism, as well as Persian Sufism. Kind of that was like the three parts. Then you find that in the earliest part of the 20th century, the first decades of the 20th century, the Theosophical Society is very prominent. And this is articulating this vantage point that all wisdom is one. There is a mystical current. There is you could say, a perennial current, right? This idea of the perennial philosophy. And, Aldous Huxley writing his book on the perennial philosophy, in which European peoples are often rejecting the institutional church or synagogue of the West. And often they're disliking that it's saying, it's not spiritual. It's often, distancing themselves from organized religion and saying there's a mystical current, there's a stifling aspect of organized religion. Then there's just the general trauma of the wars of religion in Europe. There's a European trauma about institutionalized religion, right? And so it's a turning away from that and looking for a personal experience of the transcendent, of transformation, and an openness. Now, Inayat Khan then comes in 1910, and he starts articulating Sufism. He's really the first, you could say, popularizer of Sufism in the 20th century. And at first, interestingly enough, he's teaching the 5 daily prayers. He has a few people, and it's more orthodox Chishti Sufism, right, from India. But he finds they're not, this whole conversion to Islam, they're not interested. But he finds that the Theosophical Society are very interested and starts to invite him. And so he studies and he looks and he says, okay, if I articulate Islam and particularly Sufism in the context of the Theosophical understanding, there's a great openness to it. And so he gains a big following in that context. And then, of course, there's small streams until you get to the 60s and 70s counterculture. And then all of a sudden, there is a turn east for spirituality. And of course, this is, we think of Hinduism and Buddhism and going to India for a guru and the whole hippie trail. But the hippie trail goes through Muslim countries because they took the Orient Express right, from Istanbul to Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan to get to India. So all these hippies, long-haired hippies in these pre-modern, largely Muslim societies without electricity. And many of the elders in our community who are white convert to Islam on that thing because they find authentic spiritual masters. They find their gurus in the Muslim world, essentially, right? And we could mention, the Abdul Hadi Hanerkamps or the Abdurrahman Fitzgeralds and the, Abdul Haq Godlesses. They literally became Muslim on this path, right? And so what you have then is the interpreting, taking Sufism as one of these mystical currents, right? Sufi Sam is an interesting figure who is in the Bay Area, and he was called the guru to the hippies. And he kind of pioneers a type of Sufism, which is, and he actually traveled throughout the Muslim world, but how he articulates Islam is, or Sufism is very unrecognizable to a Sufi coming from the Muslim world, right? Sufi dance and universal mysticism and these type of things, right? But the point is, you have these communities within, especially in the West Coast, they're very prominent. These communities, which again, when Sufi sheikhs or Sufi-oriented Muslims from the Muslim world come and find these groups, it's very much like, what is this? Very similar to when Muslims come from the Muslim world and see, even Imam W.D. Muhammad's community, like, we don't recognize a lot of these elements. What is this, right? And there's this really interesting parallel. And I always say, like, the fact that Rumi is the #1 selling poet in America is inseparable from the phenomena that, mindfulness meditation is taught in the boardroom and that yoga is on every corner. It is this same phenomena in the same search. And I find it really interesting, these kind of parallels. And I find that you could say that many of these, right, as you use the term proto-Islamic movements, there's almost these proto-Sufi movements, right? So I don't know if you've thought about some of that.
Well, I mean, you've said a lot, but a couple of things. First of all, I would love to see a book, Islam and the White American, and I'm sure that it would not look a whole lot like Islam and the Black American, because the white experience and the black experience with Islam, indeed the white experience and the black experience with America, these are two very, very different things. But I think that something that would seek to place that experience in the kind of narrative that could be held up and analyzed and placed in conversation with other narratives would really heighten our ability to understand what it is that we have here in America in terms of the phenomenon of Islam. And I think that in the absence of that, all of us can get sort of lost in our own corners and not recognize that there are Muslim interests outside the ones that we might generally recognize on an everyday basis. And that doesn't mean that our interests are not important. In fact, maybe our interests, for us at least, they're paramount. But that doesn't mean that they are the only interests. And so, as we proceed, we have to try to be as mindful of that fact as we can. That's the one thing. The other thing that came to my mind as you were speaking is something that I count a mistake, and that is that, you mentioned Goethe and Hafez, and connections between the Muslim world and Europe. They're centuries. They're centuries old. The intellectual borders were quite porous. And in areas that we might not even expect. One of my teachers, non-Muslim in the academy, felt very strongly that even St. Thomas Aquinas had basically been inspired by, a work by a Baghdadi Hanbali on the Sikh Nom, which enabled him to develop his dialectical method. So that there are all kinds of connections there. But what this reminds me of is this. The West is not one thing. There are several competing strands, trends in the West. Some of them are more and some of them are less hospitable or hostile towards Islam and the Muslim world. I think it is a mistake for us to allow the category West to be completely monopolized by only those who are hostile to Islam. Because in so doing, we sort of perpetuate the very hostility that they want to put out there
We
as
accept their
de-defining,
categories, yes.
as de-defining relationship between Islam and the West. Whereas, in point of fact, why is Kant any more Western than was Haman, who criticized him? I mean, quite severely. And to me, this is part of, the project of bringing the West and Westerners into, their own relationship with Islam that can be organically engaged as their own.
Yes.
All right? And quite frankly, this is one of the things that I see about Black Americans. Now, mind you, this is still a very controversial perspective, even within the Black community. But to my mind, it is, in part, the Black community in America complicates this picture of, America as this European phenomenon. There is not one America. There are several Americas. Now, there's a dominant culture in America, but I think it's a mistake to allow that dominant culture, which is only a part, to unproblematically position itself as the whole. In the context of which, you have two choices: either reject or assimilate, both of which are not acceptable to me. And there are other options, all right, that can be organically engaged as part of the West that is not the dominant West, all right, but that can speak with equal authority, all right, in the key of Islam, all right, as the West. I mean, of course, that's not the case now, but I'm talking about in terms of the kind of trajectory that Islam could put itself on, which would have the potential of really altering things from what they are now.
Yes.
And I think it's just a mistake to give over to the West only that trend that's hostile to Islam, that's that's post religion and and all these kinds of things. And I think that in that context, it would be interesting to see something, Islam and the white American.
Yeah, and I think there also, of course, because of the nature of racial history and segregation in America, there are two separate strands, but also there's a lot of interesting overlap.
Of course.
So, for instance, in Berkeley in the early 60s, we were talking about actually pre-hippies. These were like the ones that sparked the hippies, right? The whole beat. First the Beats, they took their name from the beatific vision, right? The Beats come from beatific. They're actually interested in Mississippi, and they're the ones that, what did Howl, the kind of like great poem of the Beats, Allen Ginsberg says, running through the Negro streets at dawn, right? They're crossing the color barrier on the wrong side of the tracks, and the jazz, obsessed with jazz and Black art forms and Black culture, they're crossing over. And this, because of that, they were considered edgy and in a sense, not reputable to mainstream, white society. But then you have these movements in the 60s in Berkeley, right? You have the Floating Lotus Opera. You have this real, the kind of budding of the hippie movement. And at the core of that was these beat poets, including amongst them was Daniel Abdul Moore, Allah yarhamu, who was one of my friends and one of my teachers, and Hakeem Archuleta this is before their Islam. They're all meditating and doing psychedelics and reading Rumi, and Allen Ginsberg is there. And at 2:00 they're exploring this, and then at 4:00 they go to Oakland and visit the Black Panther meeting. And you see what I'm saying? They're really crossing over. And then of course, and I think this really comes to a head in a certain sense, as I mentioned to you yesterday, in the 90s, when hip hop becomes the not only art form of the inner city East Coast, but it becomes kind of global youth culture. And then you have urban and suburban youth who are really raised by this. And of course, whatever is on the popular forms, but you scratch a little bit and you see the 5%er message. The first time I heard the name Allah was in a Wu-Tang song. You know what I mean? This is and this is generational. And I told you that anecdote that when I was in 2008, when I was studying in Cairo, and all of these tulab al-ilm, I'm talking, these are the serious students, right, converts and children of immigrants who are in America. They not just
I know many, if not most of them,
right, and not just
and I've heard some of this from some of them.
Exactly, and so devoting their this is it is and many of them now have since come back and become the generation, our generation's kind of leaders, community leaders and teachers. But we would play basketball every Thursday night. So it was all these Americans after one game sitting there, and the conversation of hip hop came up, and one of the brothers said, if it wasn't for hip hop music and culture and art, I wouldn't be here. I would not be wearing the Azhari hat, the Azhari turban. And every single brother, and there were black, white, Pakistani, Arab, Southeast Asian, we say, yeah, me too. Mm-hmm. So this was this cultural conveyance of the stream. And again, I told you, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X because the people I looked up to, they looked up to him. And I was still very young, 14 years old, but I said, well, I better know who he is. I'm embarrassed that I don't really know this. So I think there's interesting convergence of all these strands.
Yeah. I mean, look, as I said, Islam and the Black American, that's 15, 20 years ago. I talked a lot in that book. I talked a lot about the importance of black religion as a phenomenon, as a wavelength on which the message of Islam tended to travel. If I were to rewrite that book today, in fact, I could even say that was perhaps one of the oversights of that book. But the question of the continued relevance, or not the continued relevance, but the continued forcefulness of black religion as a sort of major definer of the mental landscape of black Americans. There's a question as to whether that has waned or even dissipated. And whichever of the two it may be, it seems clear to me that at some point, hip-hop picks up and becomes a wavelength on which Islam tends to travel among young people, all right? And I think that if you're telling the story of Islam in Black America, that has to be a part of it as well. And what's, you pointed it out, what's interesting about it is that it is not limited to Black Americans. Many young second generation immigrant Muslims have been very deeply influenced by hip hop. And it has been, as you mentioned, a road for some of them, sort of quote unquote back to Islam. But again, these are, it's really, I look forward to the day where we have developed both institutions and an intellectual culture that's capacious enough to manage some of the deep disagreements that might exist around these things, but nevertheless allow those disagreements to come into the room where they can be shared, talked about, mutually influenced, etc. Otherwise, things just develop in as haphazard a way as they develop, and as a community, we're always showing up, sort of a day late, a dollar short. We're always catching up rather than catching up to trends, rather than setting trends. In our cultural production, it's not guided. It's not intentional. It doesn't have specific goals in mind that it wants to achieve, and vis-a-vis which it can measure itself in terms of how close to or how far from it is from realizing its goal. But that's probably something that's that some way in the future, because there's a lot going on out there that we don't really have sort of conscious conversations about.
Yes. Alhamdulillah, you've been very generous with your time, and we should probably wrap. But I mean, there's so much to say. There's so many ways that this can go, and I think, as you mentioned, it's a time of great challenges, but it's also a time of great opportunities. And I'm really curious the ways that, adding this element, we have the black stream, the white stream, and then the immigrant stream But Islam is really part of American counterculture, as you mentioned, Western counterculture, right? Of course, you have the, African American, by definition, defining a way of being Western that is authentic and no one can challenge, but yet it is, by its very nature, it is counter. It is, right? But then you have this other interesting. Yes, please.
I mean, I get that. I get the whole counterculture thing, and on some level, even as I mentioned in Islam and the Blackamerican, on some level, I would define black people as a protest people, but I think that there's an extent to which if we are perpetually a counterculture, then that means that someone else is defining the norm.
Right.
And so we sort of fit into the spaces that are left over by what the norm has defined.
Yes.
And that's not where we want to be perpetually. I mean, we don't want to be perpetually just responding to somebody else.
Sure.
We are not you.
Yes.
We are who we are.
Yes.
Just we are not you.
No.
So I mean, I get the counterculture thing, but I think that and there's a certain amount of that that's built into, to my mind, that's built into the Tawhidic mindset. All right, because the Tawhidic mindset is always very super vigilant about false claimants to divinity or the authority that only divinity should be credited with. So that's part of the Tawhidic mindset.
That's the La ilaha.
Yeah, and that's there. But there also has to be an affirmation. Islam cannot simply be against stuff.
Yes.
I'm against this, I'm against that, I'm against that.
Right.
What are you for? What are you going to produce for the people? One of the things that America doesn't get, and I mean just America in general, there's a book by a guy named Albert Murray. It's called the Omni-American, and Murray's probably considered in some circles a conservative, but he's not one of those black conservatives, the Thomas Sowell types. He's not one of those. But at one point, he makes a point that I think will be interestingly applied to Islam. He makes the point that he's talking about the Moynihan Report and things like that, and he's whites are always, and he's writing in the 60s and 70s, by the way. So still a time of very heightened, racial tension. So he says, whites are always analyzing blacks from the perspective of the dominant culture. And in that context, always seeing them coming up sort of short, all right? But they never ask themselves, what is it that black people enjoy about being black? Right? And he says, if they could come to the black part of town for one Saturday night, right? Their analyses may change, right? Now, what I'm trying to say is that, yes, we have lots of challenges. We have, lots of things we have to confront. There are dangers out there. And so, we have to be prepared sort of to defend ourselves and, to conduct ourselves in such a way that preempt some of these things from happening to us that others want to happen to us. But we can't just get stuck there.
Right.
What is it that Muslims actually enjoy about being Muslim?
Yes, sure.
You see what I'm saying? I mean, Islam is not
absolutely.
it's not just, oh, I react to this, I react to
yes.
this. What is it that we enjoy about being Muslim? All right? And how can that be conveyed beyond our ranks? You see what I'm saying? So, I mean, I get the counterculture, and I'm not, I'm not 100% against it. All right, but that cannot be a permanent state for a successful Muslim community. And I mean, even though, again, the Tawhidic mindset, it remains vigilant, always vigilant. Yes. But what is it? I mean, what is it? What is it that I enjoy about being Muslim? All right.
Yes.
And how do we convey that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
that's one of our challenges.
Yeah.
And by the way, not only to the dominant culture, as it were, even to our kids.
Yeah, I mean, right after the current president was elected, I remember I was in doing a program with Dr. Omar Farooq Abdullah, and the organizers named it, I think it was Spiritual and Artistic Resistance in Times of Tribulation. And I love that because I, fight the power, rage against the machine. I love that. And so I did some poetry and shared some remarks, and then Dr. Omar spoke, and the first thing he mentioned, he said, we should think through the use of the word resistance. And he said, I'm not saying we should not use it, but we should think about the categories that we use first and how we define ourselves. And what I heard him saying was the Prophet ﷺ didn't define himself as the resistance to the Quraysh, but he defined what Islam was, and then they actually became the right? He didn't define himself vis-a-vis what he wasn't, he decided what he was. But the thing is, I think, and perhaps, you mentioned, I think thinking about anyone who becomes Muslim in America, for sure, but especially white people, perhaps, you don't become Muslim in almost all cases, except after a deep and sustained critique of the normative categories of America, of race, of religion. You can't. It's not.
I mean, look, that applies equally to blacks.
Yes.
And again, this is why it's really important for us as a community to have, the kinds of spaces where we can have really responsible, disciplined conversation. Because, as a convert, okay, and I think that, and this may upset some people, but, I think that as a black, people are used to thinking about blacks as people who just have nothing to lose. It's sort of, we're the middle passage people, all right? And so anything is better than what we than what we have. And therefore, because of that point of departure, many people can't see that as a black who converts to Islam, all right, at some point you conduct a critique of your society where you are, all right, of the white and the black society in which you live. You conduct a critique, all right, and you decide on the basis of that critique that I am going to move into something called Islam. And that very act of conversion, all right, subsumes that critique into it. And so even as you remain a member of that society, even as you remain attached to that society, even as you continue to recognize that society as home, that critique is still a part of who you are. That's what many people who hear somebody like me talk about America, they don't hear that. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
All right? This is a very important part for us to articulate. All right? And by the way, critique is not the same as hatred.
Yes.
I don't hate these people. I have my critique. And hopefully that critique is grounded, in my understanding
my understanding of Islam, and I will continue to try to put that forward, but hopefully it will be a constructive critique, all right? But this is a very important aspect of, of who the convert is, especially the first generation convert, all right? I mean, I could say a lot more about that, but I'll probably stop there. But this is a very important point, because people, when they hear people like you or me, say America, well, they see flag waving. That's not what we're talking about, right? The critique that said, okay, I am no longer going to be a member of the dominant black or white, all right, sort of definition of American, all right? I have a third option that I'm going to pursue, and that critique is always embedded, all right, in the very being of that convert, all right? And I think that if more people understood that, this may make some of these conversations a bit more, a bit easier, because many of the suspicions may dissipate once that's understood. Yeah.
Well, it definitely comes through to me in your writings and in my personal interactions with you that your research is a labor of love, and it is a love for people and for all people, and it is a concern with the beauty and the truth of what you have experienced in Islam be understood by all people, and that the project of Islam in America is able to navigate the challenges and vicissitudes and opportunities of this historical moment.
Absolutely.
So that comes through. And
Thank
I hope
you.
it comes through for everybody.
You put it more eloquently than I could ever hope to put it. So thank you for that.
Jazakumullah khair. Time.
Alhamdulillah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.